heavily. So today I'm going to be talking about what it means to believe in God. And that may seem like a very vague thing, and I'm sure it is, but it's something I think we should get into. So what does it mean to believe in God? Now, it may seem like a question with a simple answer at first glance, but in fact, I think it's probably one of the hardest things that we could ever try to grasp, if it even can be grasped at all. Have you ever been reading through the Bible and you come across a story that you read, particularly one of the ones like maybe you read growing up, one of the classic stories, and then something just jumps off the page at you and it hits you different than you've ever read it before? You can't quite make sense of it like you used to. That was kind of my premise for getting into what I'm going to be talking about today, in particular in regards to a passage in Genesis 32. If you guys want to turn over there, it really stuck with me and kind of made me question a lot of what I believe, or how I believe. So today I'm going to be contrasting two stories out of Genesis and explore what it can mean to believe in God. So I'm going to be in verse 24 of chapter 32. Now Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. "Jacob," he replied. "Your name will no longer be Jacob," he said. "It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he answered, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. Jacob then named the place Peniel, "For I have seen God face to face," he said, "and I have been delivered." The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip. So Jacob's name becomes Israel, or one who contends with God. Verse 28 of this passage reads a few different ways. I think the King James puts it, "For as a prince thou hast power with God." Another version says, "For thou hast contended with Elohim." Another version says, "For thou hast obtained mastery with God and with men, but has prevailed." Well, what does it mean to contend and prevail over men, and especially over God? And how might one contend with God, if that's in fact what we should be doing? Well, the Hebrew word for contend is a word seratah, meaning to persist, to exert oneself, to persevere, implying that it's a consistent behavior, perhaps involving constant discomfort or struggle. In Hosea, he recounts this story in chapter 12. He says, "In the womb he grasped his brother's heel, and as an adult he wrestled with God. Jacob struggled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He, being the angel, found him at Bethel, and there he spoke with him." A story of struggles with men and with God. And we know that to be true. We know the story of Jacob. We know his name means supplanter or trickster, the name Jacob, and his struggles with his brother Esau, tricking him out of the birthright, tricking him out of the blessing that Isaac was going to promise him, and then having to go work for Laban, something like 20 years, to get his wife Rachel. Struggles with men, no doubt. And the premise of this passage we just read, he's going to meet Esau after all this time in hopes of kind of setting things right, but he's scared of the confrontation. He's afraid for his life that Esau might still be holding a grudge against him. And he does end up having a fight, but it's one with an angel and one where his name is changed, and he's no longer a supplanter or a trickster like he used to be. He is one who contends with God, a name of valor. Now, I'd like to contrast this with another story out of Genesis that kind of tells the opposite of this story and what happened to Jacob, as I'm posing what belief in God could mean. But before we get there, kind of in the tune of opposites, we need to look at the figure of Satan, namely the title we give him of Lucifer. Now, Lucifer isn't exactly a biblical name. It came about in the 4th century, and it means bringer of light or shining one. It's also the Latin name for the planet Venus, which is sometimes called the morning star, which is interesting because Christ is also referred to as the morning star. Now, why is this important, you may be asking? And I would say two reasons. First is as it relates to a famous poem you've probably heard of called Paradise Lost by Milton. And secondly, when thinking about the name Lucifer as bringer of light, it's important as it relates to our human consciousness and rationale. See, in the poem Paradise Lost, Satan's a character that Milton writes about, and he's the highest angel in all of God's kingdom. But he's very smart, he's very crafty, probably a little too smart for his own good. And because of that, he figures he can dispense with God, how he sees the world, is sufficient, and he ought to be a ruler in his own right. So he has a monologue in this, and I hope you forgive the antiquated language. It was written in 1667. But Satan says, "Is this the region, this the soil, the clime, said then the lost archangel, this the seat that we must change for heaven, this mournful gloom, for that celestial light? Be it so, since he now is sovereign, can dispose and bid what shall be right. Farthest from him is best, whom reason hath equaled, force hath made supreme. Above his equals, farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail horrors, hail infernal world, and thou profoundest hell. Receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater? Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition, though in hell, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." That's what Satan has to say about that. And as the story goes, Satan and all his demons get cast into the underworld to suffer eternally. And we're familiar with this story. It's paralleled in both of the Testaments. Isaiah writes, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" Luke writes, Jesus is saying, "I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven." And John writes in Revelation, "And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels cast out with him." And you may be wondering, well, why is all of this important? Well, first, I think it shows that you can't dispense with God outright and not suffer terribly for it. But secondly, what I think it shows is something that the Catholic Church was concerned about during the Age of Enlightenment and the birth of scientific reasoning. They saw this growing of human intellect and rationale, and they said, okay, that's good, but here's the danger with human rationale. It often worships its own creations. Milton writes, Satan is saying, "Receive thy new possessor, a mind not to be changed by place or by time, and to reign is worth ambition, though in hell." Now, I think all this relates to our consciousness and our assuredness in our ability to rationalize our beliefs. We can, and I believe we should, think of human consciousness as light and what shines forth out of all of human intellect. Out of all of creation, for that matter. I'd go as far as saying our consciousness is probably the most important thing there is. But what's the rub in all of that? It worships itself. It forgets that it too is a product of creation and intellect. I don't find any particular distinction between, say, secular rationality or even spiritual certainty, for that matter, and the personification of Lucifer as the bringer of light. Isaiah writes, "And the Lord said, because this people draw near with their mouth, and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me. And their fear of me is a commandment taught by men." Now, it may seem that I'm kind of getting off into the weeds here a bit, and I probably am. I'm very good at that. But this story, this exact story of worshiping consciousness and certainty is played out in Genesis 2 and 3, if you guys want to turn over there. And I think these passages sound very nice in the King James. They read very well, so that's what I'm going to read from. I'll be starting in verse 16 to chapter 2. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. And then starting in verse 1 of chapter 3. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open, and ye shall be as gods. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Now, this, at least in my opinion, is a very interesting story, to say the least. Because you see, the snake tells them, Ye shall be as gods if you eat the fruit. And I find it true that we're very apt to believing that we can become something more than we are by plucking the seemingly free gift of rationalization, of confidence in knowledge. But the beginning of Genesis, further into the beginning, says we're already made in the image of God. So what would we be gaining by eating the fruit thereof? Now, as opposed to our previous passage, Genesis 2 and 3 tell us the story of gaining consciousness and pursuing enlightenment, but in a way that destroys us. Because you see, Adam and Eve trust the serpent. They trust his interpretation of rationale, his interpretation of consciousness. And something that's interesting is nowhere in the Bible is the serpent in this story related to Satan. But I think we've made that parallel very nicely, especially with the description I gave earlier of Lucifer as the dispenser of light, the shining one, the forbidden fruit, that which glimmers, consciousness gained without contention. Well, what happens to our erring predecessors? Adam and Eve wake up, but then they're cast out of paradise into what is basically hell compared to where they were. There's a price to unearned wisdom. Life outside of Eden is a spiritual death. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, And no wonder, for Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no great thing if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their destiny will be according to their work. So why is all of this important, you may be asking? And how does it relate to what belief in God is? Because neither of these stories explicitly talk about belief in God outright. But I think they pair very nicely and give us a good scaffold of which to begin to understand what belief could mean, because they're complete opposites. They give us a spectrum on which to work with. Because you see, one story is of Jacob wrestling an angel in the dark and then receiving a blessing for it. The other story is of two beings made in the image of God, but choosing their own rationale as a way to become like him through no effort of their own. And then they're cast out of paradise, and two have an interaction with the angelic, but an angel holding a flaming sword saying, Hey, you can't come back to this. I believe that the connection between these two stories is their relation between light and darkness. So there's this guy, his name's Jocko Willink. He's an ex-Navy SEAL, he's a podcaster, author, public speaker, business owner, and he's very well known for every day he wakes up at 4:30 a.m., takes a picture of his watch, posts it on social media for everybody to see how studious he is, and works out before the sun comes up. And he has a quote that says, "The sunrise is better if you've already paid for it." And I can attest to that. I'll get up and go ride my bike. You watch the sunrise, and it's beautiful, and you're like, man, that's worth it because I sweat in the morning. The light's better if there's work put in first. And as far as I can tell, that's what the Genesis 32 story is trying to tell us. See, Jacob receives the blessing at dawn, and calls the place the face of God. He sees God only after having a struggle. He only gets his reward after wrestling through the night, having his hip dislocated. A divine wounding makes him a new man, for he is no longer Jacob, but Israel. So contrast this with the Eden story. See, for Adam and Eve, the goal was the dawn itself, consciousness, rationale, the mind of God as a free gift. And what was their reward? Darkness, hell, sweat of the brow, pain in childbirth, death. See, the goal cannot be to attain certainty from God, to feel that what you know is enough, that your rational interpretation of God or what he wants can guide you to enlightenment. The famed psychotherapist Carl Jung has a quote that said, "One does not attain enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." So Israel, one who contends with God. We know that was the story of Jacob. We know that was the story of the nation of Israel. Think about the Israelites in the desert with Moses and all the struggles they had. The judges having to come and tell Israel to shape up. The times that Israel was taken into captivity. Think of King David and Bathsheba. Think of Solomon and his concubines. Think of the Jews and their rejection of Christ. Ones who struggle with God, but they're God's chosen people. As far as I can tell, the church, us, we're the new Israel. We are chosen by God. What does that mean? Well, I don't think we're chosen because of our blind acceptance of the shining fruit of consciousness, our blind acceptance of things that we hear and that we read. And we just say, well, I believe it because it says so. What I know is sufficient. I don't need anything else. I'm complacent in my certainty. I have all of the answers. Because you see, James writes, he says, "You believe that God is one. You do well, for even the demons believe and shudder." I believe rather that we're chosen because of our willingness to contend with what he's laying out before us, to become injured and changed. Paul writes again in 2 Corinthians, "For if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation. For the old man has passed away, and the new man has come." So what is belief in God? Like I said, it may seem something simple at first glance, but do you believe in him how Adam and Eve believed in him? That by accepting the fruit of consciousness, the thing that shines out of the darkness, that can be gleaned without a struggle, that you too can become as gods? Well, we know that we were made in the image of God already. Nothing we can gain can further make us in his image. For if we are to believe that we are ones who contend with man and with God, we must also believe that the divinity that resides within us is at constant struggle with and against our human consciousness. And we must also believe that it's an eternal struggle that we are to live out in order to become more than we are. So belief in God, to me, at least, is a life of trying to figure out what to do, how to act, how to interact with others, how to think. I don't think it means, like I said, to hear stories and just accept them at face value, but to challenge and examine and question and doubt. Because all too often we rely on our ability to rationalize belief, to convince ourselves, to convince others that what we claim to believe is the absolute truth and there's no questions left to answer, nothing left to wrestle with. But who can rationalize what God is, what he wants? Because if all it took to proclaim belief was to eat the fruit of knowledge and be enlightened, we would all be in a proverbial Eden already. But we know that's not the case. It's not that simple. Because we live in the world after the fall, where God asks us to struggle, to contend, to wrestle with, to obtain mastery over. In the dark, no less, with the possibility of being injured, but ultimately to prevail. Because the result of that is the blessing of the dawn, the earned sunrise, the face of God. It is my hope that we can persist through the struggle and be known as ones who contend, rather than as those who comfortably rest in our supposed rationality. It is my hope that a life of belief is lived out as a daily manifestation of this. But in times where we face such injuries, that we can turn to one another and struggle together. And if there are struggles that you need to make known, or you feel the need to take action and begin this life of belief through giving your life to Christ, I hope you make that known as we stand and sing.